This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, and this is episode 705 of the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, sponsored by FanDuel. Thanks for tuning in. Before getting into this week's 15 transactions, I want to remind you about FanDuel Face-Off. FanDuel Face-Off is where you compete in quick, fun games against other real people for real cash. It has all sorts of games that you're familiar with, like Home Run Derby, Wheel of Fortune, puzzle and strategy games, and there's more on the way. Contests are action-packed and last between 2 to 5 minutes, so you can play on your couch, waiting in line, during a commercial break, wherever, and on your schedule. Plus, you can practice for free anytime. Whether it be head-to-head, multiplayer, or larger tournaments, FanDuel Face-Off has something for you. Plus, in most contests, you'll be matched against other players of similar skill level, so you're never totally overmatched even as a beginner. Face-Off is also tied to your FanDuel account and wallet, so you can easily use your daily fantasy funds or sportsbook winnings in the app. Visit FanDuel.com/faceoff or download the FanDuel Face-Off app in the Apple App Store today to get in the game. Age and location restrictions apply, void where prohibited. See FanDuel.com/faceoff-terms for terms and conditions. Sell Joe Mixon. So I've talked about Mixon on this show throughout the season and how he's done a really good job in expected fantasy points. But as a lot of people have told me, expected fantasy points don't score fantasy points. That's not how fantasy points are scored. But entering week 9, Mixon led all of fantasy football in expected fantasy points. That's according to Pro Football Focus's model. He was just playing well below expectation. Touchdown regression was going to eventually hit. He had only scored twice on 12 goal line attempts. But obviously that all changed in week 9. He scored 5 times. He had the highest fantasy total by any player this season. And right now might be the perfect time to sell. I talked about this a little bit on last week's mailbag episode, but if you're looking toward the playoffs, his matchups in weeks 15, 16, and 17 are not good. The Bengals get the Buccaneers, Patriots, and Bills during that stretch. That's the toughest playoff schedule for running backs in all of fantasy according to my adjusted fantasy points allowed method. New England and Tampa Bay in particular, they rank as top 5 tough matchups against running backs. I do think that Mixon should still be able to provide you some sort of floor. I'm just worried about the ceiling, because those matchups are not easy in the fantasy playoffs. Buy Amon-Ra St. Brown. So let's just be honest. Since week 2, Amon-Ra St. Brown has not been that great in fantasy football. He hasn't ranked higher than wide receiver 23 in PPR formats in any week since that point in time. And he hasn't found the end zone since then. Now, I get it. He was a little bit banged up. But over the last couple of weeks, he's provided an average of 11.7 PPR points per game. That's far below what we're expecting from him. But I'm still more on the buy side than the sell side for St. Brown. The Lions do have a below average schedule for wide receivers from here on out, but St. Brown's averaged almost a 33% target share per game over his last 2. And in week 9, without TJ Hawkinson, St. Brown's target share was 37.5%. You have a talented player, and you have a talented player who's seeing a lot of volume. That usually wins out at the end. Add Jeff Wilson. So Wilson's sort of a fringe ad this week because he's only available in 48% of Yahoo leagues. But it wouldn't be right if I didn't mention him. He was another player that I talked about on last week's mailbag episode. And I talked about how Wilson being in that backfield, that was a bigger deal for Raheem Mostert than Chase Edmonds being there. Wilson was a much bigger threat to Mostert, and we saw that right away. He played 49% of Miami's snaps against Chicago on Sunday. Edmonds hadn't hit that high of a mark since week 2. And that resulted in Wilson carrying exactly half of the team's running back rushes. And he had a 10.3% target share. He was a top 10 running back this past week in PPR formats. And as I've been saying about this Miami backfield, they have a very good schedule moving forward. Over the next 4 weeks, no team has a better schedule for running backs in fantasy football than the Miami Dolphins. So I think that Wilson can do a lot for your playoff push. Add Deshaun Watson. We were going to get to this point eventually, right? Deshaun Watson's set to return against the Texans in early December, but his percent rostered number is going to see a rise with each passing week. At this time, he's rostered in 28% of Yahoo leagues. So right now might be the time to stash him. We know that on a football field, Watson has crazy fantasy upside. Add Donovan Peoples-Jones. So the Browns' passing attack is probably going to get somewhat of a boost when Deshaun Watson comes back. And that's going to help someone like Donovan Peoples-Jones. But here's the thing. DPJ has been low-key pretty good over the last handful of weeks. He's hit a 20% target share in Cleveland's offense in 4 of his last 5 games. He scored between 9 and 13 PPR points in all of those contests. And he's done that while failing to record a touchdown. And the Browns have a good schedule in the fantasy playoffs. They get the Ravens, Saints, and Commanders. I think Peoples-Jones should be rostered in far more than 20% of Yahoo leagues. Buy or hold James Conner. So I wrote this in the 15 transactions email, but it says, warning, this is a high variance transaction. Proceed with caution. We finally saw James Conner on a football field again. His stat line wasn't amazing. He scored just 11.4 PPR points, but there's definitely a lot to like about what we saw this past weekend. He played 71% of Arizona's snaps. That's just 1 percentage point off of his season high. And he also saw 58% of Arizona's running back rushes and a 15% target share. Those numbers combined with some goal line work, that could take Conner into RB2 territory pretty consistently moving forward, if we were to assume that he's going to maintain that. But yeah, obviously James Conner can't stay healthy. And I've also got to add that the Cardinals have one of the toughest schedules for running backs in fantasy from here on out. So like I said, this is a high variance move. On one hand, strength of opponent only means so much. And Conner's trending towards seeing the type of workload that you want from a running back in fantasy football. On the other hand, things can go south very quickly. So if you're able to send something that's not very significant to get James Conner right now, after this mediocre performance, I don't think that's a bad idea. Because a lot of fantasy managers want off of this James Conner roller coaster. Add Terrace Marshall. So I talked about Marshall on last week's Sleeper Show, and I do think that he should be added. Over the last 2 weeks, he's seen a 25% and 20% target share in this Carolina offense. He's had 15 total targets. The Panthers are likely going to trail in games. They're not a good football team. So if he can keep up that target share pace, he's going to be a decent fill-in for you. And the Panthers have one of the best wide receiver schedules from now through the end of the year. So you can add Terrace Marshall this week. Sell Devontae Adams. So again, last week's mailbag episode, I talked about Adams. And I talked about Adams being a buy, not a sell. Well, I'm flipping the script a little bit. Because I didn't expect Devontae Adams to score 36.6 PPR points on Sunday. He went absolutely nuts. He had a 47% target share in that Raiders offense. He had 17 total targets. But now might be a good time to sell, especially if you're a borderline playoff team. Because over Vegas's next 3 games, they get the Colts, Broncos, and Seahawks. Those are all bottom 5 matchups for wide receivers in adjusted fantasy points allowed to the position. But of course, like I said last week, he is Devontae Adams. He's still going to produce. We should just temper expectations after what we saw in week 9. Add Odell Beckham. So the Odell Beckham chatter is heating up. Jay Glazer reported that Beckham will be ready and cleared by the end of the week, so fantasy managers, they're going to be looking for him off the waiver wire. That means you probably should be too. Now do keep in mind, according to Fantasy Points Dr. Edwin Porras, Beckham could return in the middle of November all the way through the middle of December. His real return to the football field may not be immediate. The good news is that Porras believes that it's reasonable to expect 80% to 90%, quote, prime OBJ when he's back on the field. That's good news. And chances are Beckham's going to land with a contender. He's going to go to a good team. And that hopefully means a team with good quarterback play. So that's going to help him be fantasy relevant. Buy George Pickens. A lot of people want nothing to do with the Pittsburgh Steelers offense, and I totally understand why. They're 31st in yards per drive. They're 31st in scoring rate per drive. They're dead last in touchdowns scored per drive. They have 6 passing touchdowns on the year. That's tied for last. The offense has been horrible. But that's also what makes George Pickens an interesting buy low candidate. Chase Claypool is now in Chicago. Over 17% of the team's targets in Pittsburgh are now up for grabs. Now, we can't assume those looks are going to go to one player. But team target share always equals 100%. There's at least opportunity for a player like George Pickens to see more work. And he has a lot to gain. Over his last 2 games, he's seen a 14% and a 7.5% target share. First-year wide receivers tend to perform better during the second half of their rookie seasons. And Pittsburgh wide receivers have only 2 bad matchups by adjusted fantasy points allowed from now through the end of the year. In fact, when looking at their median opponent, Steelers wide receivers have the best schedule in all of fantasy from here on out. So coming out of their bye, now might be the perfect time to trade for George Pickens. Add Kylan Hill. So Aaron Jones had an ankle injury on Sunday against Detroit, but it sounds like he's going to be okay. Tests reportedly came back negative. With that being said, it's early in the week. Who knows what this injury is going to look like towards the end of the week? A.J. Dillon would get an obvious bump if Aaron Jones is sidelined. But don't sleep on Kylan Hill. He got his first carry of the season in week 9 after being activated from the PUP, and he's someone that my prospect model loved as an undervalued player coming out of last year's draft. Injuries have just derailed any opportunity. But with this Aaron Jones injury, he might have some opportunity. The bottom line is the waiver wire is pretty rough this week. So these deeper adds like a Kylan Hill, that's the direction that you likely have to go in. There's absolutely no reason to spend any significant free agent budget on Kylan Hill, at least in a redraft league. Sell Tyler Algier. Cordero Patterson is back, and Tyler Algier had his lowest snap rate since week 3 this past week. That resulted in just 33% of the team's running back rushes and a 4.3% target share. Those are bad numbers. The good news, though, is that Algier still scored 13 PPR points because he had crazy efficiency. He had 123 total yards and 11 touches. So there is still an opportunity potentially to sell high. Because we can't bank on that type of efficiency, on that type of production per touch. Now, Atlanta's probably going to keep Algier involved in this committee. And the Falcons do have a good schedule for some positive game scripts moving forward. It's just that this usage, it took a very clear hit with Patterson back. But his production remained the same. So with worse usage but similar production, that screams sell. Add Jimmy Garoppolo. Week 10 doesn't have the best streaming options at quarterback, but I do think that Jimmy G works. He obviously has his new weapon in Christian McCaffrey, and he's facing the Chargers, a team that ranks middle of the pack in adjusted fantasy points allowed to quarterbacks. The 49ers also have an implied team total, according to FanDuel Sportsbook, of almost 27 this week. Garoppolo scored between 16 and 18 fantasy points in each of his last 4. I think he's a pretty safe option. Add the New Orleans Saints defense. So the Saints have a short week and they get the Steelers coming off a bye. So there is some risk in using them this week. But with that being said, they're 3-point road favorites, and the Steelers have surrendered a top 10 performance to an opposing defense in 5 of their last 6 games. So I think New Orleans works as a streamer. Add the Los Angeles Chargers defense. Now, I would not use the Chargers this week against the 49ers, but it's a bad week for the waiver wire. So I figured that I would give you guys a little bit of a look-ahead defense. Objectively, the Chargers have the best playoff schedule of any defense in fantasy football. They get the Titans in week 15. Tennessee is currently the 13th best matchup for opposing defenses in adjusted fantasy points allowed. And then in week 16, they get the Colts. They're the best matchup. And then the Rams, the second best matchup. So if you're in a deeper league, you might be able to add LA right now. But at the very least, you can keep an eye on them. That's it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you've yet subscribed to the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter @LateRoundQB. Remember to check out LateRound.com, join the Patreon, and subscribe to the newsletter. You can get access to the Discord community through the Patreon, and that community is amazing. You guys definitely should check it out. Go to LateRound.com. Thanks for listening, everyone. I'll talk to you tomorrow with the Weekly 10 Trend Show.